stop worrying about the sale and start to understand the world your customer lives in and become a subject matter expert. We were a technology vendor, and one of their competitive salespeople called me. We spoke for an hour, and never once did she say, "You should come partner with us." She was a wealth of knowledge about the industry. She was a subject matter expert. She was always her top salesperson, always the top earner in her company. Because as she started to have conversations with customers and start to get these customer insights, she would share that with marketing. She would have never got to that level if she didn't start to understand, my job isn't to quote unquote close the deal. My job is to help my customer make the most informed decision possible.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Marketing Blender Show. I'm your host, Daisy McCarty, and I have today with me special guest Carlos Hidalgo. Carlos is one of our fractional chief marketing officers here at the Marketing Blender, and he's joining us today to talk about the growth mandate for B2B CMOs. Carlos, since this is your first time on the show, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and tell them a little bit about your background?
Yeah, thank you very much, Daisy. So I've been in B2B marketing for far longer than I care to admit, about 30 years. Actually started in a nonprofit doing content marketing long before anybody called it content marketing. So it was a great training ground for me. I have owned a number of agencies myself, and so primarily work in B2B marketing and help organizations develop strategies that lead to long-term sustainable growth.
Thank you, Carlos. You had an interesting statistic that I thought you could share with the audience. Would you mind going over what you shared with me this morning?
Yeah, so Merkle came out with a report that showed some interesting things for B2B CMOs. The report actually looked at B2C and B2B, but what they showed was that 20% of B2B CMOs are more likely to focus on brand, and out of that, 8% of these CMOs, their number one mandate is growth. So they're more likely to report that as their number one mandate than other CMOs. And I just thought it's so interesting to see more and more we're seeing CMOs being tasked with, you are a growth driver for our organization. And as I talk to CMOs, it's far different than what we saw 15 years ago, even 10 years ago. Everybody was talking about CMOs wanting a seat at the table. Well, now they have a seat at the table and they have to deliver.
It's the hot seat.
That's right, absolutely.
Well, I'm actually excited by that because we've always held at Marketing Blender that marketing should be driving growth. It should be driving revenue, reputation, and resilience. So I have no issues with sitting at that seat at the table and saying, we're going to drive growth. When you're talking about brand, give me some insight into how you view the way brand relates to helping CMOs deliver on that growth promise.
Well, I mean, as you well know, here at Blender, we talk about brand a lot, and we say it's not a logo, it's not a color scheme. I was talking to a client yesterday, and they said, I have to enhance my brand. And they said, and we need some new website. And I'm not talking about just fancy colors. I was like, okay, you're starting to understand what brand is. I really think brand is there to help build trust with your customer. And so if you don't have trust with your customer or even prospective customers, it's going to be very hard for you to ever turn that customer into a larger revenue source and expand that customer lifetime value. And you're surely not going to get that opportunity with a prospect. So understanding how your customers see you is really is how you understand brand, and building that trust within that brand so that they continue to invest in your product or your service or your solution. That's how brand will drive growth. It's going to attract more of your target customers to your brand and to your organization.
That's excellent. There are also several other ways that I see brand helping drive growth, and the first one is driving profitability. There's a lot of data to support the fact that when a prospect is primed with your brand advertising before they buy, you're able to charge a premium for your product or service. And this is something I talk with my clients about a lot, which is, do people know the right things about your brand? Do enough people know about your brand that they have, to your point, that trust factor of, I'm buying from a well-established, well-known organization. It's de-risking my decision because I know the reputation of this brand. The second one is around organizational growth, because without good talent or employer branding, you're going to struggle to attract and retain the types of talent that actually help you grow. So we often begin with our clients talking about revenue growth, but once we've overcome their current revenue plateau, the next issue they're facing is, my gosh, we can't hire enough people. to service all the new customers that are coming in, we need help with our talent branding. And then the third aspect is about the relationship that customers have with the brand versus with the salesperson. So in the old days, all salespeople were always like, this is my book of business. If I ever leave, I'm taking these customers with me. That doesn't really happen.
Right.
It's actually more and more common for buyers to be embedded with a relationship in the brand itself. So your top salesperson could leave and they're not actually going to take customers with them if you've built a strong relationship with your brand versus a particular human being.
That's such an important point. And going back to your second point on the employees, the employer branding, what are you doing there? Your employees are actually an offshoot of your brand. They represent your brand. And so if the idea of the salesperson taking their book of business with them, well, if they've interacted with professional services or support or anybody in the organization, if they're eating and breathing and living that brand, Tim Cook from Apple says it's part of the DNA of our organization. So anytime you engage with someone at Apple, they're living that brand. That likelihood of that salesperson walking out the door with that business goes down tremendously because, to your point, they've established a relationship with the brand, not necessarily one person in the company.
That's a very good point. There's another question I'd like to ask you, and this is around how brand and demand work together to drive growth. You have a lot of experience with demand gen, so dive into that for me.
Yeah, it's really interesting when I look at organizations. Sometimes the brand, you can almost tell where they've put most of their efforts and where they've put most of that investment. I kind of refer to it as the golden thread of consistency. So when you start with brand engagement, and ultimately at the end of the day, you want your customers to be advocates and defenders of your brand. Well, there's so much that happens in between that. So I can engage with your brand long before, and most of us do, long before I buy anything. And in a B2B context, I may be a tire kicker for 18 months before I actually have a trigger event that pushes me in to a purchase process. What I find with a lot of organizations is the brand is here and then demand is somewhere like way off. And it's almost like two different disciplines or two different groups have managed each of these areas and each of these disciplines of marketing. And there's no consistency for the customer, which leads to a very bad experience. And so brand should be that softening of the beachhead for demand generation. And then demand generation should have all of the tenets of the brand that go through the content and through the messaging and through the digital engagement to make sure that customer has a consistent experience.
So brand obviously has tangible aspects to it, but it's still kind of the touchy-feely part of marketing. So let's get down to the brass tacks, which is technology. Mm-hmm. How do you use technology to drive growth?
Yeah, I find that most organizations have technology bloat. They're so bloated with technology, and I understand it. It's fun, it's sexy, the newest shiny object, and it's very easy to get distracted. The way I've always approached technology for our clients is it's an enablement. So define your brand. What is it? How are you going to communicate your brand? What are those brand tenets that you're going to take out to your customers and to your target audience? And then from a demand perspective, the same thing. What does that strategy look like? Is it an ABM strategy? Is it a one-to-many strategy? What does that strategy look like? And then determine now what technology do we need to enable that strategy. So many times organizations get it backwards. New CMO comes in, oh, we've got to swap out this, or we need to add this, we need intent data, so we've got to buy a 6 Sense, or we have to go do ABM, so we're going to buy demand base. But there's no forethought into how are these tools going to be used, which led to the stat last year from Gartner that said 33% of organizations, only 33% of organizations are reporting full utilization of their marketing technology. So if
that seems high.
That's what I said. That's exactly what I said. But if I'm a CFO and I'm reading that, I'm a little ticked off because now I'm saying, well, what are we spending our money on? Yet this year, a lot of research has shown we're going to be spending more on marketing technology. So I sit here and I wonder, I'm like, are we living in Groundhog's Day? Has nobody learned anything? So strategy first, technology second.
I completely agree. One of our CMOs is working with, ironically, a technology company. These are some of the worst about buying too much technology. And the very first thing that she did was cut their tech stack by 30 to 40% because it was being used for things that didn't work. And I actually find this is some of the highest cost tech bloat is on the sales side, frankly. And there's something that rhymes with Minfo that people pay a lot of money for, and they never use it the way it's intended to be used. They call it leads, and it's just a contact database. It's just contacts. It's not leads. But immediately, as soon as she cut those, they came back and they're like, well, can we use this AI tool for our sales outreach? It was like, nothing in your sales outreach has been working for the last year. So no, you don't get to use AI to take something that's not working and do more of it. Fix the underlying problem first, and then we can talk about creating efficiencies. And that's the number one thing that I say. Very first place to use technology is to take something that's already working and make it more efficient. So on the marketing side, that can look like automation, some AI-generated content, and I'm sure we'll talking about that in another episode. And then, market research and insights. Second thing to fix is stuff that's not working well.
Correct.
But you have to figure out why it's not working before you use technology to fix it. So all that root cause analysis is very important. Some of that can look like, I was doing this type of lead gen and now it's stopped working, which we see a lot. There's things that work well, and then marketers come in and ruin it by overdoing it and spamming people. So, things like cold email. I was talking with a tech company, again, the tech companies, that a couple of years ago, and they were like, all of our leads used to come from cold email, and now we can't do cold email anymore because it's stopped working. Yeah, that's an area where you want to look at, okay, you've taken something that used to work at some point in the distant past, no longer working. What are the ways that you can actually add back in the personalization and humanity into things like cold outreach using technology, but using it in a way that actually up-levels that communication? And then, of course, the third one, and the one that everybody would like to start with, but it actually takes the most time, is understanding what are the blue ocean opportunities that you have with technology. So what are the areas that your competitors are missing the boat, where you can come in and use technology in a very strategic way to capture an advantage, to do the things that they haven't even thought to do yet, to do the things that are going to be helpful for you 3 years down the road when all of your competitors have been left in the dust. So it's tempting to pull back from that swing at the fences kind of thinking, but it's actually, once you've got the nuts and bolts taken care of, once you've got the foundation in place with efficiency and effectiveness, you really do need to be thinking about what's the biggest risk that I can take with technology and what's the upside of that.
At the Marketing Blender, we have fractional CMOs and outsourced marketing teams to drive your success. The two most common problems that we are approached about is how do we break revenue plateaus and accelerate success, or how do we attribute marketing to revenue impact? And the answer is that we build a system, because your marketing should be driving revenue, it should be driving your reputation, and it should be driving resilience. If you want to learn more, check out themarketingblender.com.
You mentioned tech companies being the worst offenders.
Yes.
And salespeople. I also see, sales has to have their own email tool. And so we have Outlook, and then we have Outreach, and we have so many of these systems. I remember one time, a number of years ago with a client, we were talking about their technology stack. And so I went to, thankfully they had a very large whiteboard. And so we just started to write out all the different technologies. And then we started to look at the integrations. And the CTO was in the room. And he's like, I didn't know we had that one. Mm-hmm. I didn't know we had that one. And there was very little integration. Well, what had happened was each of these different technologies had their own database. There was no single source of truth. They couldn't get a proper view of their customer. So their retention rates were down. Their cross-sell, upsell numbers were down. The amount of revenue they were getting from their customer base was dropping year over year over year. Now, was it all the fault of technology? I don't think so. But it was a really clear picture. And in that room, they identified over $500,000 of technology that they could sunset without disrupting the business.
Rogue IT, it is a real problem.
Yes, it is.
So let's talk a little bit about going back to the human side, the role of customer insights in driving growth decisions.
Yeah, you were just talking about how do we use technology to get closer to our customer and gain a competitive advantage. I am a huge believer, and I will say this as many times as I have to. Anything you're going to do with marketing starts with your customer. So if you're going to go out and do a big branding project, beyond calling us, I would say start with your customer. What does your customer think of your organization? What does the customer think of your brand? What's important to your customer? Daisy, you show a slide in some of the work we do with our clients that is really, really eye-opening, and it's the first time I had seen it, was what companies think is important versus what the customers think is important. And to see those numbers, it's a little startling, because we have this idea of what we are to our consumer or our prospect or our customer, but do we really know them? And so I am such a believer in understanding what makes your customers tick. We know in B2B now, we're selling to buying groups. We're rarely selling to just one individual. So defining those personas, understanding the channels that they use to collect information, understanding what's important to them, what's that trigger event that pushes them into a purchase, and then what do we need to do to bring that buying committee together? Because the latest research that I saw was that it's 38% of that purchase during that purchase process. That first 38% is where the deal falls apart, because nobody in the company can agree on a path forward, because they're all looking at it from an individual lens of their jobs and their roles. So it's the job of marketing to bring that group together so that you don't lose to status quo, you actually win the deal. You can't do that unless you know your customer and then understand the journey they take to make that purchase.
Whenever I start an engagement with a new client, voice of the customer interviews are one of the most critical pieces of that process. Now, here's the sticky bit. You're not supposed to change your whole marketing strategy or your messaging based on what one customer says. One customer can be wrong, but not all of your customers are wrong. So if I'm hearing the same thing over and over and over again in those customer interviews, that is going to take me directly back to my client to say, you're not allowed to say these things anymore about your brand. Your customers don't care about them. This is the stuff they actually care about. This is what they recognize as being true about your brand, and this is what they value. I had an interesting experience with this a couple of months ago. There was a sales team, and they had figured out this cool selling point that they were hammering on in every sales conversation. But when I talked with their customers and posed the question, if I made this statement, how would you feel about it? And I gave them the pitch that the salespeople were giving, and they were like, not really. I mean, hypothetically, that might be true. And some of them were like, that's just BS. So they were telling me the truth. They weren't telling this to the salespeople, but they were telling me this selling point that's supposedly so great. Nobody believes it. So I had to take that back to the sales team and say, no more saying this. It sounds cool, and it might hypothetically be true, but it's not true in the real lives of your customers. So we have to figure out what is the thing that is true for them and what helps them make progress.
It's that old adage, just perception is reality.
It is.
Right? And so I would love to understand, and you don't have to share the secrets, but who in the sales organization was like, this will be the key to unlock all these deals, and the customers are like, eh. So the other thing I see with that too is the voice of the customer research is you will have, and I was talking to a prospect the other day where they did all that, and they said the CEO, they started to present, and they were like, well, that customer doesn't know what they're talking about, or that customer is an outlier. And so starting to poke holes in every different interview or all the different data because the CEO didn't like what she was seeing. And so there's that as well. And then the other mistake I see is when we go out and interview our customers, we're going to go talk to our top customers. And so you're going to get a very slanted view of those insights if all you do is go out and talk to your top customers. So take a few of your top, take a few of your mid, take a few of your lower, get a good representation of your customer base, go do that insights, and then you can decide, and from there, it'll dictate your strategy, what content you need to develop, how you need to develop it, what channels you need to be on, so on and so forth. But if you start to cherry pick and then you see what you don't like and you go, oh, well, that customer's no good. Well, you've just put a lot of money into insights, but you're not going to use them, and you're going to repeat the insanity that you've been doing year over year.
Yes, one of my favorite types of interviews to do, if I can get it, is former customer interviews. If
yeah.
I can get an introduction to somebody who left,
Yes.
oh, that's so much gold.
It is
in there.
gold, absolutely.
You don't get to argue with, hey, I took my money somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because there's a reason for that.
Yep.
So talk to me a little bit about the relationship between the CMO, sales, and finance, because all of these should care about the same thing, which is growth.
Yep.
But there's not always an opportunity to see eye to eye between those groups.
Yeah, I'm still amazed that here we are in 2025, and we're having to talk about marketing and sales alignment. It is, yeah, it just boggles my mind, but it's still there because we're human, and as long as humans are running things, we will have struggles. I actually personally don't think that marketing and sales alignment is the problem. I think it's a symptom of a bigger problem. And again, getting back to customer insights is, do you have a shared view of your customer? Do marketing and sales both understand who your customers are, what makes them tick, how they purchase, what's important to them? Back to your example, really cool pitch from a sales team. If that had worked and they were right and the customers were like, yes, that's intriguing, I'd dive into that. Does marketing know that? So those are the types of things that, from my perspective, that's why I say demand gen is not a marketing only discipline. It's marketing and sales working together. And so if you have a shared view of your customer and then common measurements among both groups, that alignment goes away pretty quickly, because now marketing and sales are working together, dare I say, compensated on the same things. When I ran a marketing team at a software company, my team, part of our compensation was based on pipeline contribution and contribution of revenue. I wanted my team to start to think like salespeople. You always hear, oh, salespeople are coin operated. I'm like, well, nobody comes here for free. We're all getting paid.
Yes.
Right? So there's that. And then finance as well, back to the growth. If I don't know how to demonstrate marketing's contribution to growth as a CMO, chances are I'm not going to last real long. I'll probably be replaced. So you have to start to speak a language of finance. You have to understand what a P&L is and what a balance sheet is. You have to be able to demonstrate, you gave me $1, this is what I returned from it. Attribution has always been a struggle for marketers. And we could probably do multiple episodes on attribution. I'm not a big fan of multi-touch attribution. I think, a lot of organizations go crazy over it. Nobody asks a salesperson, so was it the third conversation you had with the prospect or the seventh one that closed the deal? Mm-hmm. But understanding some basic things of, did we source that? Did we contribute? Did we influence that purchase? How are we, what are we doing to retain our customers from a marketing and sales perspective? Because what's the number one budget that always gets cut during the crunch? Marketing. Why? Because marketers, by and large, have done a terrible job at demonstrating, for all the money we're investing, here's what we're returning back to the organization. And notice I didn't say spending, I said investing. Marketing is an investment, not a cost. So if you start to understand the language of finance, when they come to you and say, we're going to cut your budget by 15%, you should be able to very quickly say, okay, if you cut us by 15%, these are all the different things that are going to happen to our contribution to revenue. And have that conversation with your CFO. If you can start there, not only will you have a seat at the table, you'll keep your seat at the table.
It is tragic that marketing is so often the thing that gets cut when there's a downturn. Because if marketing is doing its job, that is the growth engine.
Absolutely.
That's like saying, well, we need to cut down on car expenses, so let's stop buying gas. Okay.
Yeah.
You got a shiny automobile, but it's not going anywhere.
I hope you live on a hill.
Yes, because you've just said, I don't care about future revenue.
Right.
That's okay. We'll just churn whatever we can through the sales team and hustle harder. But
Yeah.
we're cutting off our future pipeline.
Well, and I talked to a company just last week. I talked to the CMO, and To start the year, they hired about another 15 field sales reps. And her response to the CEO was, who's going to feed them? And he said, well, you are. She said, well, my budget's flat. Basically, it was like, figure it out. So there, in that organization, that is a sign of misalignment. So you're hiring, this sales thing is just put more feet on the street. Well, you have to enable them with something. That's part of marketing's role. So it's not just, it'd be like, well, just, put more gas in the car. Well, it's full already. There's nowhere else for the gas to go. So I just can't pour more into the car. So to me, it's part of the fault of the CMOs that don't understand how to speak the language of the business. And really, if you look at finance, operations, sales, marketing seems to be the only one that continually has to fight to justify its existence.
That's very true.
And I learned it years ago when I worked at McAfee, and I had a boss who came to me. He was the president of our division, and he said, I need to know what you're doing to bring revenue into this organization, and I need that this week. And if you can't tell me, your replacement will. It was a really good motivational talk.
For sure.
And this was long before we had all these tools. So we did pretty much a week of spreadsheet camp where we just sat in a room and took our budget and understood it. It was such a good lesson for me to say, okay, yes, I'm a marketer, but I have to think with a financial side as well. And so we were able to demonstrate what we were doing. If you give us $1, we return 8 to the organization. I'll take that all day long.
For sure. So I have to go on a little bit of a rant here around what Carlos said about, they hired 15 new field sales reps. It is so common for me to come into an organization that has a woefully imbalanced sales versus marketing resource allocation. And often it looks like we have 20 sales reps and we have maybe one person in marketing, maybe two if they're lucky. And this is something that makes absolutely no sense, because if you look at how people actually buy, that first at least 80% of the buyer journey takes place before they talk to a salesperson. So you've said, okay, we're going to have 20 people who handle the final 20% of that journey, and we're going to have one person who's responsible for the entire initial 80%. So every single touch point that people have for 80% of their journey, guess what? If it's not with sales, they're engaging with marketing content. They're engaging with the brand. So it's a completely misaligned spend and allocation of resources. And not only is 80% of that current buyer journey taking place in marketing, but guess what? Everybody who's future funnel, future pipeline, not ready to buy right now, which is 97% of the market, all of that future pipeline, the only interaction they're having is with your marketing as well. So you have now one person who's responsible for 80% of buyer journey for people who are currently in market and 97% of your future revenue. It doesn't make sense. And here's the kicker. For most of these organizations, the person that they have in that one marketing role is a tactician and not a strategist. So they're actually reporting to the head of sales and effectively to all 20 salespeople as an order taker. And basically sales admin, oh, I need this case study, I need this deck, I need this thing, I need this one pager. And there's no one sitting in the strategic role within the organization saying, how do we serve those prospects through the first 80% of their journey, and how do we secure that 97% of your future revenue growth instead of just letting the competition have it?
And that's if you only have one audience segment in your business. Multiply that. So to your point, I mean, it's woefully imbalanced in so many organizations. The other thing, which I encourage every salesperson to do, I love to sell, but at the same time, stop worrying about the sale and start to understand the world your customer lives in and become a subject matter expert in that. And I go to an example way back when I started one of my first agencies. We were a technology vendor. And one of their competitive salespeople called me. And I thought, oh, here we go. It's going to be the pitch to become a partner with them. We spoke for an hour, and never once did she say, you should come partner with us. We talked about the industry. We talked about customers. We talked about what's happening in marketing and sales and B2B. She was a wealth of knowledge about the industry. She was a subject matter expert. And no surprise, she was always her top salesperson, always the top earner in her company, because she knew how to guide, and she actually became an ally with marketing. Because as she started to have conversations with customers and start to get these customer insights, she would share that with marketing. She'd land a big deal. She'd go to marketing and say, hey, here's all the steps we went through, and here's what was really important to them. She would have never got to that level if she didn't start to understand, my job isn't to, quote unquote, close the deal. My job is to help my customer make the most informed decision possible. And so to me, yes, there's a shift in marketing for growth. There's just as much of a shift in how salespeople need to react, because to your point, that 79% of that journey is self-driven by B2B customers. As a salesperson, I can be involved with that if I'm contributing to marketing, I'm out on social talking about the industry at large. Now I become a source of knowledge for a customer who's looking to make a purchase.
Thank you for making that point, because that's absolutely true. Social selling, brand advocacy, these are sales activities that do make a difference. Yes, it's harder to do attribution, again, for those activities, but every time I find a top salesperson within a B2B organization, they're the one that takes the time to go spend 5 to 10 minutes on social media every day, making sure that their personal brand and their business brand are aligned and that people know who they are for the right reasons.
And social selling is not sending me an unsolicited LinkedIn message asking for 30 minutes of my time because you've got the latest, greatest AI tool. Social selling is sharing information that's going to be helpful to your customers.
Yes, and we have an episode about social selling, so go check out our channel and you'll find that. Final question, we touched a little bit on marketing attribution. What's the number one piece of advice you'd give to CMOs today if they want to do attribution better so that they can make the case to the sales team and to the CFO that they are helping drive growth?
I would say if you're not doing it today, start simply, right? Because it can become a beast, especially if you have multiple channels, multiple audience segments. But start really simply. That's point number one. Number two, align your measurements with your sales team. So again, I always like to bring in recent conversations that I had. I was talking to a vice president of demand gen about attribution. And he said, it's actually pretty loose here. And I said, what do you mean? He said, if we had a prospect or a contact up to 2 years ago who interacted with marketing content and closed today, marketing gets credit. I said, wow, that's actually really very loose. He said, and I said, does everybody in the organization agree with that model? He said, yeah, even sales. I said, okay, I don't love it, but marketing and sales both agree to it. So you're not going to get into a room with this finger pointing of, well, we already had a conversation with them. That's not your lead. Mm-hmm. So that agreement is so important. And it's not just a verbal agreement. Documented. I have a rule that says if it's not, well, I know we have a rule, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. And so document what those measurements are. And if all you're going to do is start with, we're going to measure funnel conversion, whether it's an account-based or a one-to-many lead-based environment, just start to measure what is that transition from top of funnel to bottom of the funnel. We're just going to start there. Or start with, I'm putting this much into this channel, how much am I getting out? Then start to mature and start to put a roadmap. Eventually, if I were starting a marketing department today, one of my first hires would be a data scientist. Just got a report this morning on my email that talked about marketing still struggling with using their data effectively. So really important hire, and I think it's becoming more and more important. But start simply, align with sales, and make sure that everybody's in agreement of this is what we're measuring and this is what it means.
All right, you heard it here first, data scientists, we need you. Thank you everyone for watching. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe. We'd really love you to go through our episodes. We have so many great topics. We love to give tactical, practical advice as well as strategy. You can always check the show notes. We drop additional insights for you there. Thank you, Carlos, for being on the show. Onward and upward.